In a quiet little neighborhood where the streets were lined with neat rows of houses and perfectly trimmed lawns, there lived a woman who everyone knew as the Rule Keeper. Her name was Karen Thompson, but to most people in the area, she was simply HOA Karen. She wasn't just any ordinary homeowner. She was the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, which meant she had the power to enforce rules that governed how the neighborhood looked and felt. Karen moved into the community 5 years ago with her husband and 2 kids. At first, she seemed like a regular person, friendly enough, always dressed sharply and eager to help out. When she joined the HOA board, many residents thought it was a good thing. After all, having someone passionate about keeping the neighborhood looking nice sounded ideal. Who wouldn't want their property values to stay high? But what started as a mission to maintain order quickly turned into something else entirely. See, Karen loved being in charge. It gave her a sense of purpose, a feeling of importance. She carried around a clipboard everywhere she went, jotting down notes whenever she spotted something she didn't approve of. A mailbox with chipped paint? Write it down. A car parked on the street overnight? Add it to the list. Even a garden gnome sitting too close to the sidewalk earned a glare from Karen's sharp eyes. And if you broke one of her precious rules, well, get ready for a fine. At first, the fines weren't a big deal, maybe $20 here, $50 there. People grumbled, sure, but they paid up because, honestly, who wants to argue with someone holding a clipboard and quoting pages of tiny print guidelines? Plus, Karen made it sound so reasonable. "It's for the good of the neighborhood," she'd say with a tight smile. "We need to keep things looking nice." But over time, something changed. The fines got bigger and they came more often. Suddenly, every little thing became a violation. Did your curtains peek out from behind closed blinds? Fine. Was your dog barking while you were at work? Another fine. Left your trash can visible after collection day? Yep, you guessed it. A fine. No matter how small or silly the offense, Karen found a way to penalize it. What no one realized back then was that Karen had struck a secret deal when she took over as HOA president. In exchange for her role, she negotiated a commission for every fine issued. At first, it wasn't much. Maybe $5 here, $10 there. But those numbers added up fast. For Karen, this wasn't just about enforcing rules anymore. It was about making money. Lots of it. Her obsession with control grew, stronger with each passing month. She spent hours patrolling the streets, inspecting yards, and scrutinizing details that no sane person would care about. If a house number plaque was slightly crooked, Karen noticed. If someone painted their front door a shade of blue that didn't match the approved palette, Karen sent them a stern letter demanding immediate action, and attached a hefty fine, of course. The other members of the HOA board tried to reason with her at first. They'd gently suggest that maybe some rules could be relaxed or that perhaps not everything needed a penalty. But Karen always had an answer ready. "Rules are rules," she'd snap, tapping her clipboard for emphasis. "If we let one thing slide, where does it end?" And so, the fines kept coming. Some residents joked that Karen probably dreamed about handing out penalties. Others avoided eye contact when they saw her walking down the street, clipboard in hand. A few brave souls attempted to stand up to her, but those who did usually regretted it. One man tried to protest a $150 fine for leaving his recycling bin out past noon. Instead of backing down, Karen doubled the fee for arguing with authority. Another neighbor got hit with 3 separate fines in 1 week after daring to question whether the HOA even needed so many rules. Despite the growing resentment toward her, Karen thrived. With her newfound income stream, she upgraded her lifestyle significantly. She bought designer clothes, splurged on a luxury SUV, and installed a heated pool in her backyard, all while lecturing others about financial responsibility. To Karen, these luxuries were proof that hard work paid off. What she failed to realize, or maybe chose to ignore, was that her actions were tearing the neighborhood apart. Behind closed doors, whispers of discontent began to spread. Neighbors talked about how ridiculous the fines had become. They shared stories of unfair penalties and questioned where all the money was going. Surely the neighborhood should look better if the HOA was collecting so much cash. Yet nothing seemed to improve. The playground equipment remained rusty, the streetlights flickered, and potholes dotted the roads. Something wasn't adding up. Still, Karen remained untouchable, at least for now. She strutted through the neighborhood like a queen surveying her kingdom, convinced that she was doing what was best for everyone. Little did she know her reign of terror was about to face its biggest challenge yet. Karen's grip on the neighborhood tightened with each passing month. What started as a mission to keep things tidy had morphed into something far more sinister, a personal crusade fueled by greed and an insatiable need for control. The fines kept coming, faster and harsher than ever before. It didn't matter how small or trivial the offense was. If Karen could find a way to slap someone with a penalty, she did it. And she did it with a smile. Picture this. One morning, a retired teacher who lived alone in a cozy little house decided to put up a bird feeder in her front yard. She thought it would be a nice touch, something cheerful to brighten her days and maybe attract a few cardinals or blue jays. But when Karen spotted it during one of her infamous inspection walks, she marched straight up to the woman's door. Clipboard in hand, she announced that bird feeders were strictly prohibited under HOA guidelines. Not only that, but the placement of the feeder violated a rule about visual obstructions. The fine, a staggering $250. The elderly woman was stunned. She tried to explain that she'd lived in the neighborhood for over a decade and had never heard of such a rule. But Karen wasn't interested in explanations. With a cold smile, she handed over the citation and reminded the woman that failure to comply within 48 hours would result in additional penalties. Defeated, the teacher took down the bird feeder, feeling both humiliated and angry. Stories like this became common knowledge around the neighborhood. People began tiptoeing around, Karen terrified of doing anything that might catch her attention. Some even joked that they needed permission slips just to mow their lawns or water their plants. One guy got fined because his mailbox leaned slightly to the left after a storm. Another family received a notice saying their Halloween decorations were inappropriate because they included a plastic skeleton hanging from a tree. When they asked what exactly was inappropriate about it, Karen simply shrugged and said, "It gives off a bad vibe." But here's the thing. While Karen was busy policing everyone else's lives, she seemed completely blind to her own behavior. Her backyard pool parties went late into the night, with loud music and laughter echoing through the streets. Cars parked haphazardly in her driveway blocked the sidewalk, forcing neighbors to walk in the road. Yet somehow none of these infractions ever made it onto Karen's clipboard. If anyone dared to mention it, she'd brush them off with a wave of her hand. "I'm the president of the HOA," she'd say smugly. "I know the rules better than anyone." This double standard didn't sit well with many residents, but fear kept most of them quiet. A few brave souls tried to push back, though, and those confrontations often ended badly. For them. Take, for example, the man who owned a small landscaping business. He spent weekends working on his own yard, planting flowers and trimming hedges, to make his property look picture perfect. One day, Karen accused him of using unapproved mulch and slapped him with a $300 fine. Furious, he showed up at the next HOA meeting to argue his case. Standing in front of the board, he presented receipts showing that the mulch he'd used was identical to the brand recommended by the HOA. He pointed out that several other neighbors used the same product without issue. But instead of listening, Karen cut him off mid-sentence. "You're disrupting the meeting," she declared, glaring at him. Then, without missing a beat, she added another $100 fine for disrespectful conduct. The room fell silent as the man stormed out, fuming. Word of incidents like this spread quickly, fueling resentment among the residents. They started sharing stories over coffee or during casual chats at the park. At first, it was mostly complaints, grumbling, about unfair fines or ridiculous rules. But soon the conversations turned darker. People began wondering where all the money was going. Surely the HOA must have been raking in thousands of dollars every month with all the penalties Karen was handing out. So why hadn't the neighborhood seen any improvements? Why were the playground swings still rusty? Why hadn't the cracked sidewalks been repaired? One evening, a group of frustrated homeowners gathered in a living room to vent their frustrations. There was a retired engineer, a young couple with 2 kids, a single mom who worked long hours, and a handful of others. As they talked, pieces of the puzzle started falling into place. Someone mentioned seeing Karen driving a brand new luxury SUV. Another neighbor recalled hearing rumors that she'd installed a heated pool in her backyard. None of these things came cheap, especially not on the salary of a typical HOA president. That's when the retired engineer spoke up. "Something doesn't add up," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "We pay our dues, we get fined for everything under the sun, and yet nothing changes around here. Meanwhile, Karen's living large. Don't you think it's time we figured out what's really going on?" The idea struck a chord with everyone in the room. For years, they'd let Karen run rampant because they didn't know how to stop her. Now, armed with suspicion and a growing sense of injustice, they decided it was time to fight back. The engineer suggested requesting copies of the HOA's financial records. After all, homeowners associations were required by law to disclose their finances upon request. If there was anything shady going on, the numbers would reveal it. The group divided tasks. Some offered to dig through old emails and letters from the HOA, looking for patterns or inconsistencies. Others volunteered to talk to neighbors, encouraging them to share their experiences and gather support. The single mom, who had experience dealing with legal documents, took charge of filing the formal request for the financial records. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen wasn't likely to hand over anything willingly, but she also knew they had the law on their side. As the weeks passed, tension in the neighborhood reached a boiling point. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, exchanging nervous glances whenever Karen walked by. They weren't sure what they'd uncover, but one thing was certain. Karen's reign of terror couldn't last forever. Little did they know, their investigation would lead to discoveries far worse than anyone imagined, and set off a chain of events that would change the neighborhood forever. The group of neighbors had officially decided it was time to take action. They weren't just a bunch of disgruntled homeowners anymore. They were investigators, determined to uncover the truth about Karen and her iron-fisted rule over the neighborhood. The retired engineer, who had become the de facto leader of the group, spent hours poring over old HOA documents. He scoured emails, meeting minutes, and newsletters, looking for anything that seemed off. Meanwhile, the single mom prepared a formal request for the HOA's financial records, knowing full well that Karen would try to block them at every turn. When the request was finally submitted, Karen didn't hide her irritation. She called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, claiming the request was a waste of everyone's time, and insisting that all finances were in order. But the neighbors weren't backing down. They showed up to the meeting armed with questions, ready to challenge Karen's authority for the first time in years. At the meeting, tensions ran high. Karen sat at the head of the table, her clipboard resting beside her like a weapon. She tried to brush off their concerns, saying things like, "If you have issues with the rules, maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." But the group wasn't having it. One by one, they spoke up, sharing stories of unfair fines, ridiculous penalties, and general frustration with how the HOA operated under her leadership. The young couple stood up and described how they'd been fined $100 for leaving their porch light on past midnight, a rule they hadn't even known existed until Karen slapped them with the citation. A retired schoolteacher recounted how she'd been penalized for planting flowers that were too bright for the neighborhood aesthetic. Even the man with the landscaping business chimed in again, reminding everyone of his mulch fiasco. Each story painted a clearer picture of Karen's reign. It wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about control, power, and increasingly, money. Karen grew visibly agitated as the meeting went on. Her usual calm demeanor cracked and she began snapping at people. "You're all being ridiculous," she said, slamming her hand on the table. "These rules are here for a reason. If you don't like them, leave." But her outburst only made the group more determined. They knew they were onto something and they weren't going to let her intimidate them anymore. After the meeting, the group reconvened at the single mom's house. They were exhausted, but energized. For the first time in years, they felt like they might actually have a shot at taking Karen down. The next step was waiting for the financial records to arrive. When they finally did, What they found inside shocked everyone. The documents revealed a tangled mess of questionable transactions. Fines that residents had paid, sometimes hundreds of dollars at a time, weren't being used to improve the neighborhood, as promised. Instead, large chunks of the money were disappearing into accounts linked directly to Karen. It turned out she had set up a system where she received a percentage of every fine issued. At first, it was small amounts, $5 or $10 per penalty, but over time those numbers added up. Thousands of dollars had funneled straight into her personal bank account. Even worse, the record showed that many of the fines themselves were either exaggerated or completely fabricated. Some residents had been penalized for violations that never actually occurred. Others were hit with multiple fines for the same offense, despite having already paid the original amount. It was clear that Karen had been manipulating the system to line her own pockets, all while lecturing the neighborhood about responsibility and property values. As the group pored over the evidence, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The retired engineer pulled out a calculator and started tallying up the numbers. By his estimate, Karen had siphoned tens of thousands of dollars from the HOA over the past 3 years. That explained the luxury SUV, the heated pool, and the designer clothes. It also explained why the neighborhood itself hadn't seen any real improvements. All that money was funding Karen's lifestyle, not fixing potholes or upgrading playground equipment. Armed with this damning information, the group knew they had to act fast. They decided to file a formal complaint with local authorities, attaching copies of the financial records as proof. The process wasn't easy. Karen had connections in the community, and she fought back hard, threatening legal action against anyone who dared accuse her of wrongdoing. But the group held firm. They had the truth on their side, and they weren't going to let her bully them into silence. Word of the investigation spread quickly through the neighborhood. Residents who had once kept quiet out of fear now came forward, with their own stories. An elderly widow tearfully admitted she'd been fined so many times she could barely afford groceries. A college student living with his parents revealed he'd been penalized for parking his car on the street overnight, even though it was technically allowed according to the HOA guidelines. Every new story added fuel to the fire, strengthening the case against Karen. Meanwhile, Karen began to panic. She could feel the walls closing in. Her usual confidence wavered, replaced by paranoia. She started avoiding public spaces, skipping neighborhood events, and even ducking behind curtains when she saw groups of neighbors talking outside. Gone was the woman who strutted around the streets with her clipboard, issuing fines left and right. In her place was someone desperate to cling to power no matter the cost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the neighborhood, Karen stood on her porch, clutching a glass of wine. She stared out at the rows of houses, her mind racing. How had things gotten so out of control? She told herself it was all for the good of the neighborhood, that the rules were necessary, the fines justified. But deep down, she knew the truth. Somewhere along the way, she'd lost sight of what really mattered, and now there was no turning back. The next morning, the authorities arrived at her doorstep. 2 plainclothes detectives rang her doorbell, holding a warrant for fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. Karen answered the door in her silk pajamas, still groggy from sleep. At first, she tried to deny everything, insisting she'd done nothing wrong. But as the detectives laid out the evidence, the financial records, the forged signatures, the falsified inspection reports, her defenses crumbled. Within minutes, she was in handcuffs, being led away from the home she'd worked, so hard to dominate. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others cheering quietly. For years, they'd lived under Karen's oppressive regime, afraid to speak up. Now justice was finally being served. But the fight wasn't over yet. With Karen removed from power, the neighborhood faced a new challenge: rebuilding trust and restoring a sense of community. It wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to try for themselves, for their families, and for the future of the neighborhood they called home. The morning Karen was arrested, the neighborhood felt like it had been hit by a storm. People peeked through their curtains, watching as police cars pulled up to her house. The sight of officers leading her out in handcuffs sent shockwaves through the community. Some residents couldn't believe what they were seeing. Others stood frozen, unsure whether to feel relieved or guilty for not speaking up sooner. For years, Karen had loomed over them like a dark cloud, and now that she was gone, the air seemed lighter, but also uncertain. As word spread, neighbors began gathering in driveways and front yards, talking in hushed tones about what had happened. One woman described how she'd seen Karen pacing on her porch the night before, clutching a glass of wine and looking unusually agitated. Another neighbor recalled hearing raised voices from inside Karen's home earlier that week. It was clear that even Karen must have sensed her downfall was near, but nothing could have prepared anyone for the spectacle of her arrest. The authorities didn't waste any time. Detectives combed through her house, seizing documents, laptops, and bank statements. They found receipts for luxury items, designer handbags, spa treatments, even vacations, all paid for with money siphoned from the HOA. Investigators discovered that Karen had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks, forging signatures on official forms and falsifying inspection reports to justify the fines she issued. She'd created an entire system designed to funnel cash into her own pocket while keeping everyone else in line. For the residents, learning the full extent of Karen's deception was both infuriating and heartbreaking. Many felt betrayed, wondering how someone entrusted with protecting their neighborhood could exploit it so ruthlessly. Others admitted they'd suspected something was wrong, but hadn't dared to speak up, fearing retaliation. A retired teacher who'd been fined multiple times for minor infractions broke down in tears during a meeting saying, "I just wanted to live peacefully. I never imagined this would happen." With Karen out of the picture, the neighborhood faced a daunting task: cleaning up the mess she'd left behind. The HOA board needed to be completely restructured, and new leaders had to step forward. This wasn't easy. After years of living under Karen's thumb, many people were hesitant to get involved. Who wanted to take on the responsibility of running an organization that had become synonymous with corruption and abuse? Despite the challenges, a small group of determined residents stepped up to lead the charge. Among them was a middle-aged man who ran a local hardware store. He'd always kept to himself, avoiding conflict whenever possible. But after seeing how Karen's actions had divided the neighborhood, he decided it was time to make a change. "We can't let one person define us," he told the others at a makeshift meeting held in his garage. "This is our home, and we deserve better." Together, the group drafted a plan to rebuild trust and transparency within the HOA. They promised to eliminate unnecessary fines and focus on improving the community instead. Fines would only be issued for serious violations, and all decisions would require approval from a majority vote at open meetings. Financial records would be posted online for everyone to see, ensuring no one could manipulate the system again. Their efforts quickly gained traction. Neighbors who had once avoided each other started reconnecting, sharing stories and ideas for making the neighborhood a better place. A young couple volunteered to organize a block party, hoping to bring everyone together in a spirit of unity. An elderly man offered to teach gardening classes, teaching kids and adults alike how to grow vegetables and flowers. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere shifted from fear and resentment to hope and collaboration. But rebuilding wasn't without its challenges. Some residents remained skeptical, worried that the new leadership might repeat Karen's mistakes. Others struggled to let go of old grudges, holding on to bitterness about the fines they'd been forced to pay. To address these concerns, the new HOA board held regular town hall meetings, inviting everyone to voice their opinions and ask questions. They listened patiently, acknowledging past grievances while emphasizing their commitment to fairness and accountability. One particularly tense meeting focused on what to do with the funds Karen had stolen. While investigators worked to recover as much of the money as possible, there was no guarantee it would all come back. Should the HOA reimburse residents who'd been unfairly fined? Or should the recovered funds be used to fix long-neglected issues like potholes and broken streetlights? The debate grew heated, with emotions running high on both sides. In the end, the group compromised. Half the recovered money would go toward refunds, and the rest would be invested in community improvements. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood began to heal. Streets became safer as volunteers organized. Cleanup days, picking up trash and planting trees along sidewalks. Kids played freely in the park, no longer afraid of being scolded for stepping on the grass. Even the rusty playground equipment got a fresh coat of paint, thanks to donations from local businesses. Life was far from perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, Karen's legal troubles dragged on. Facing multiple charges, including fraud, embezzlement, and forgery, she initially tried to defend herself in court, claiming she'd only acted in the best interest of the neighborhood. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. Bank statements, forged documents, and testimony from dozens of residents painted a damning picture of greed and manipulation. Eventually, Karen pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was ordered to repay the stolen money, perform hundreds of hours of community service, and attend ethics counseling. Though justice had been served, the scars Karen left behind took longer to fade. For some residents, the experience had been traumatic, leaving them wary of authority figures and distrustful of rules. Others found themselves questioning whether they could have done more to stop her sooner. At one meeting, a single mother tearfully admitted, "I stayed quiet because I thought it was easier. But maybe if we'd spoken up earlier, none of this would have happened." Her words resonated deeply with the group. They realized that while Karen's actions were unforgivable, the real lesson lay in what they'd learned about standing up for themselves and each other. By working together, they'd managed to reclaim their neighborhood, not just from Karen, but from the fear and division she'd sown. And though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, they were committed to building a stronger, kinder community for future generations. In the end, Karen's downfall became a turning point, a reminder that power unchecked can corrupt, but unity and courage can overcome even the darkest storms. As the neighborhood continued to heal, its residents vowed never to forget the lessons they'd learned. After all, they weren't just neighbors anymore. They were a family, bound together by shared struggles and triumphs. And families look out for each other. With Karen gone and the neighborhood slowly piecing itself back together, life began to feel different. The air was lighter, the tension that had hung over the streets for so long finally lifting. People started smiling more, waving to one another as they passed by. It wasn't perfect. There were still lingering wounds from years of living under Karen's oppressive rule. But there was a sense of hope in the air, hope that things could be better, not just okay. The new HOA board worked tirelessly to undo the damage Karen had caused. They scrapped dozens of unnecessary rules like the ones about mailbox colors and holiday decorations. Instead of policing every little detail, they focused on practical improvements, fixing potholes, repairing broken streetlights, and planting flowers along the main road. For the first time in years, residents noticed actual changes happening around them. The playground equipment no longer squeaked with rust and the cracked sidewalks were smoothed out. These small victories might have seemed insignificant to outsiders, but to the people who lived there, they meant everything. One of the biggest shifts came during community events. Before Karen's reign, the neighborhood used to host annual block parties and summer barbecues. But those traditions had faded away as Karen tightened her grip, discouraging gatherings she couldn't control. Now, the new board brought them back, and then some. A young couple organized a movie night in the park, setting up an old projector and showing family-friendly films on a giant sheet. Kids sprawled on blankets, munching popcorn while parents chatted nearby. Another neighbor hosted a front porch concert, inviting local musicians to perform on driveways and lawns. Music filled the streets, laughter echoed through the trees, and for a few hours, everyone forgot about the dark chapter they'd endured. These events weren't just fun. They were healing. Conversations flowed freely between neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear or frustration. Old friendships were rekindled and new ones formed. One evening, a retired teacher found herself sitting next to a single mom at a potluck dinner. They struck up a conversation about gardening, which led to weekly coffee dates and eventually a shared project, turning an empty lot into a community garden. Together, they rallied volunteers, dug beds, and planted vegetables. By fall, the space was bursting with tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, all free for anyone to pick. Even the kids noticed the difference. Without Karen prowling the streets, ready, To find someone for leaving toys outside or drawing with chalk on the driveway, they felt freer to play. Sidewalks became canvases for colorful hopscotch grids and swirling doodles. Bikes zipped down cul-de-sacs, and laughter rang out late into the afternoon. Parents no longer worried about being penalized for letting their children enjoy the outdoors. For the youngest members of the neighborhood, this newfound freedom felt like magic. Of course, rebuilding trust didn't happen overnight. Some residents remained cautious, hesitant to fully embrace the changes. A few grumbled about how much work it would take to maintain the improvements or questioned whether the new HOA board could truly stay transparent. To address these concerns, the board made communication a priority. They held monthly meetings, posting agendas online ahead of time and encouraging everyone to attend. Financial updates were shared openly, and decisions were made democratically, with input from as many voices as possible. Slowly but surely, skepticism gave way to optimism. Karen's absence also forced people to reflect on their own roles in what had happened. At one meeting, a man who owned a landscaping business stood up and admitted he'd stayed silent for too long, afraid of crossing Karen. "I let her walk all over us because I didn't want trouble," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But staying quiet didn't protect me, it hurt all of us." His honesty opened the floodgates, prompting others to share their own regrets. A woman confessed she'd stopped decorating her house for Christmas after being fined for having lights up past January 1st. A teenager revealed he'd stopped inviting friends over because Karen always complained about noise levels. Each story reminded everyone of the toll Karen's behavior had taken, not just financially but emotionally. As time went on, the neighborhood transformed in ways no one expected. Neighbors started looking out for one another, forming bonds that went beyond casual greetings. When a storm knocked out power for 3 days, people checked on the elderly and delivered meals to families with young kids. When a single dad struggled to fix his leaking roof, a group of men showed up with tools and helped him patch it up. Acts of kindness became contagious, spreading from house to house until helping each other felt like second nature. Karen herself faded into obscurity. After serving her sentence, she moved out of the neighborhood, unable to face the stares and whispers. Rumor had it she rented a small apartment downtown, far away from the manicured lawns and tidy streets she'd once dominated. No one knew or cared, for sure. What mattered was that she was gone, and the neighborhood belonged to its rightful owners, the people who lived there. Looking back, residents realized Karen's downfall had taught them something profound. Power unchecked can corrupt, yes, but unity and courage can overcome even the most toxic forces. They learned that standing up for themselves wasn't just about protecting their wallets, it was about protecting their humanity. By coming together, they hadn't just defeated Karen, they'd rediscovered what it meant to be a community. Years later, when newcomers asked about the scars on the playground fence or the fresh coat of paint on the clubhouse, longtime residents would smile knowingly. "That's a story for another day," they'd say, exchanging glances. And though they rarely spoke of Karen anymore, her legacy loomed large, not as a cautionary tale of greed, but as a reminder of resilience. Because when the dust settled, the neighborhood hadn't just survived, it had thrived.